The first thing I noticed when I walked to the front door wasn't the silence. It was the smell. Something was different. Not wrong exactly, just rearranged. Like someone had been living in my house long enough to make it smell like someone else's life. I stood in the doorway for a moment with my deployment bag still on my shoulder, taking in the living room I hadn't seen in 11 months. Same couch, same television, same photographs on the wall above the fireplace. But something underneath all of it had shifted. The way a house shifts when it settles on its foundation, quiet and irreversible and only visible once you know what to look for. I set the bag down on the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the house the way sounds echo in a space that hasn't had enough people in it lately. Or maybe too many. I wasn't sure yet which one it was. My name is James Calloway. I'm 38 years old. I serve as a logistics officer in the United States Army for 12 years, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to Kuwait. I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, 20 minutes from Fort Bragg, which meant the military wasn't a surprise or a detour. It was a geography of my entire childhood. I knew what deployment looked like before I ever signed my name on anything. I knew what it did to marriages. I knew the statistics. I married Rachel anyway, because when you meet someone who makes the world feel steady, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about statistics. Rachel Voss had grown up in Charlotte, the youngest daughter of a family that had done well in commercial real estate over 2 generations. She was 32 when we met at a mutual friend's barbecue in the summer of 2015. She was standing near the back fence holding a glass of sweet tea, arguing with someone about something, and laughing at the same time. I thought that was the best combination of things a person could be doing simultaneously. We talked for 4 hours that afternoon. I drove home thinking about her the entire way. We were married 14 months later in a small outdoor ceremony in Charlotte with 60 people, a string quartet, and a sunset that looked like someone had arranged it. Her parents were gracious, if slightly uncertain about a son-in-law whose career came with regular absences. My parents drove up from Fayetteville and cried during the vows. My best friend, Tyler Marsh, stood beside me as my best man. Tyler, and I had met at Fort Bragg 8 years earlier. He was also a logistics officer, same unit, different company. We had spent more time together in the field than most brothers spend in a lifetime. I trusted him the way you trust someone after they've helped you carry things that were too heavy for one person. That's the kind of trust that builds quietly and feels permanent. It isn't always, but I didn't know that yet. The deployment orders came 14 months after the wedding. 11 months in Kandahar province, advising an Afghan National Army Logistics Battalion on supply chain operations. It wasn't the first time I had deployed after making promises to someone, but it was the first time I deployed as a husband, and that distinction carried a weight I hadn't fully anticipated. The morning I left, Rachel drove me to the base before sunrise. She was quiet in a way she sometimes got quiet. Not sad exactly, just interior, like she had pulled herself inward to protect something. She held my hand during the drive and didn't say much, and I didn't push her to. We had already said the important things. At the gate, she hugged me hard and then let go quickly, the way people do when they've learned that holding on too long makes leaving harder. "I'll call when I land," I said. "I know," she said. Then I went through the gate and she drove away. I watched her taillights until they disappeared. Then I turned around and walked toward the plane and Afghanistan and 11 months of work that would keep me too busy most days to think about how far away home was. We talked when connection allowed. Video calls from the FOB, choppy and pixelated, but enough. She told me about her work. She managed events for a hospitality company in Charlotte, and about her parents and about the small repairs the house needed and about the neighborhood and about nothing in particular. The kind of conversation that is actually about something very specific, which is that we are still here and you are still there and the distance is real. But so is this. Tyler checked in on her once a month. We had arranged that before I left. He lived 40 minutes from our house and was between deployments, working a training role at Bragg. Checking on Ratch, I had told him. She's tougher than she looks, but she shouldn't be alone with all of it. He had clapped me on the shoulder. Of course, man. She's family. I believed him. I had no reason not to. The last 2 months of the deployment were the busiest. Supply chain disruptions, a change in command, the logistical complications that come with any transition period in a forward operating environment. My communication with Rachel dropped from weekly to every 10 days to once a month as the work consumed everything available. She said she understood. I believe that too. I came home on a Tuesday in March. The flight from Kandahar to Ramstein to Atlanta to Fayetteville took 31 hours with layovers and delays. By the time the taxi pulled onto our street in Charlotte, we had bought a house in a quiet neighborhood off Providence Road 18 months before the deployment. I had been awake for 22 hours and was running entirely on the particular fuel that comes from knowing you are almost there. The lights in the house were on. I paid the driver, grabbed my bag, and walked to the front path. I had a key. I had sent a message from Atlanta that I was on my way. I let myself in, and that was when I noticed the smell, and the silence, and the particular stillness of a house that knows something before you do. Rachel was in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with her back to me when I came through the hallway, and for a moment I just stood there looking at her. 11 months of distance collapsed into that 1 second. The particular relief of seeing someone familiar after a long time away. Then she turned around, and I understood immediately. Not everything, not the full shape of it, but enough. She was 6 months pregnant. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In my experience, 4 seconds is a very long time for a silence to last. Rachel's hands moved to her stomach, an instinctive gesture, protective, which told me everything about how long she had been living with this particular knowledge and how often she had rehearsed this moment and how little the rehearsal had helped. "James," she said. My voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected. "How long have you known?" Her eyes didn't leave mine. "Since January." It was March. She had known for 2 months and hadn't said anything. That was the first calculation my mind made before I stopped making calculations and just stood there letting the room be what it was. I set my bag down on the kitchen floor. I pulled out a chair at the table where we had eaten breakfast every morning before the deployment, and I sat down. Then I asked the question that had formed itself in the 4 seconds of silence and hadn't gone anywhere since. "Whose is it?" Rachel closed her eyes briefly. She sat down across from me, and when she opened her eyes again, she said the name I had been afraid of since the moment I understood what I was looking at. "Tyler," she said. Just that, just his name, quiet and complete and irreversible, sitting on the table between us like something that had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. I didn't yell. I want to be clear about that, because I know it might seem strange. 12 years in the Army teaches you a particular discipline around emotion that isn't suppression exactly, but more like calibration. You learn that the loudest response is rarely the most effective one. And in that kitchen, at that table, sitting across from my wife who was carrying my best friend's child, I was not thinking about what response would feel good. I was thinking about what was true and what came next. What came next in that moment was nothing. I stood up from the table. I walked through the kitchen and up the stairs to the bedroom that had been mine and Rachel's, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Downstairs, I could hear Rachel moving. I could hear the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of traffic, and the house settling the way old houses settle at night. I sat in the dark for a long time, not because I had nothing to think about, because I had too much, and it needed to organize itself before I trusted myself to speak. An hour later, I came back downstairs. Rachel was sitting on the couch. She looked like she hadn't moved. I sat in the chair across from her, the same chair I had sat in during 100 ordinary evenings, and I looked at her for a moment before I said anything. "How long?" I said. Her voice was very quiet. "About 4 months in. 4 months into the deployment. 7 months ago. She had been carrying this for 7 months. And Tyler," I said. She nodded. "Is he aware?" She nodded again. "He knows." There it was. He knew. My best man. My brother in arms. The man I had asked to look after my wife while I was 11 time zones away in a forward operating base in Kandahar. He knew for 7 months and had said nothing. He had continued to check in, the occasional text, the brief calls. He had said everything was fine. "I want to know something," I said. Her eyes were wet now. Was it the whole time? She shook her head quickly. No, she stopped. It wasn't planned. That wasn't actually what I had asked. But I let it go because the answer to the question I had actually asked, was it the whole time, was not something I needed to hear in order to understand the shape of what had happened. I understood the shape already. What I needed now was not more information. What I needed was space and time, and the particular clarity that only comes when you stop trying to outrun a difficult truth and let it catch up. I slept in the guest room that night. I was too tired to do anything else, and too much had happened for sleep to come quickly. So I lay in the dark looking at the ceiling and thinking about the deployment and the phone calls and the months of distance and the man I had trusted with the most important person in my life, Tyler Marsh. We had been friends for 8 years. I thought about his voice in the text he had sent. Everything's good, man. Rachel's doing well. I thought about his face at my wedding, standing beside me at the altar, hand on my shoulder. I thought about the barbecues and the game nights and the long drives back from field exercises when we talked about the future. I thought about how trust, when it breaks, doesn't break loudly. It goes quiet, and the quiet is worse. By 3 a.m, I had stopped thinking about Tyler and Rachel and had started thinking about something else. Because underneath everything else, underneath the grief and the anger and the disorientation of coming home to a life that had rearranged itself, underneath all of that, something cold and precise had begun to form. Not revenge exactly. Something more structured than revenge. 12 years in logistics had given me a particular skill set. I was good at seeing systems, at understanding how pieces connected, at identifying pressure points. And lying there in the dark in the guest room of my own house, I began to understand that what had happened to me was not simply a personal betrayal. It was a legal situation. And legal situations had solutions that didn't depend on how loud your response was. I got up at 6. I showered and dressed and drove to a coffee shop on South Boulevard that opened early and had the kind of corner booth that allowed a person to think without being interrupted. I ordered black coffee, and I called a number I had stored in my phone for nearly a year without using it. The number belonged to a man named Robert Cahill. Cahill was a family law attorney in Charlotte. I had met him at a veterans networking event before the deployment, and we had exchanged cards. I had filed his number under the category of things I hoped I would never need. He answered on the 3rd ring. Robert Cahill. Robert, this is James Calloway. We met at the Bragg Veterans event last year. A brief pause. Yes, James. What can I do for you? I took a sip of coffee. I came home from deployment last night. I said, my wife is 6 months pregnant. My best friend is the father. Another pause, longer this time. I'm sorry to hear that, he said. His voice was measured, professional, the voice of a man who had heard difficult things before and knew that the appropriate response was clarity, not performance. Can you come in this morning? Yes. 8:30? I'll be there. Robert Cahill's office was on the 3rd floor of a building off East Moorhead Street. He was 51, broad-shouldered, salt and pepper hair. The kind of steady physical presence that made you believe a room had gotten a little more solid when he entered it. He poured me coffee from a carafe on the credenza and sat across from me and listened for 20 minutes without writing anything down. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a series of questions that were precise and practical and stripped of any emotional weight, which was exactly what I needed at that moment. The house, he said, whose name is on the deed, both of ours. When did you purchase it? February 2016, before the deployment. Yes. Any joint accounts? Yes. 3. Savings, checking, joint investment. He nodded. Has she been accessing these accounts during the deployment? Regularly, yes. That's normal for a deployed service member spouse. He noted something. Children prior to this? No. And, he paused carefully. The other individual, Tyler Marsh. You said, he's also military. Active duty, training role at Bragg. Robert nodded slowly. We talked for another 40 minutes. By the end of the conversation, I had a clear picture of where I stood legally, financially, and practically. None of it was simple. Some of it was painful in ways that paperwork doesn't fully capture, but all of it was navigable. Robert walked me to the elevator. When we were done, he shook my hand. James, he said, I want to say something that isn't legal advice. I looked at him. whatever you decide about the marriage, and that decision is yours to make carefully. Don't let the anger make it for you. He held my gaze. You came home. That matters. Take a few days before anything becomes formal. I nodded. I will. He pressed a button. One more thing. Yes. Whatever Marsh told you or didn't tell you, that's a separate conversation from what you do with your marriage. Don't combine them. I thought about that on the elevator down. He was right. They were two separate things, and they required two separate kinds of clarity. I did not call Tyler that day, or the next. I went back to the house, and I slept in the guest room, and I ate breakfast in the kitchen, while Rachel sat across the table, and we talked in the careful, quiet way of people who are both waiting for the other person to say the thing that will tell them which direction this is going. On the third morning, she asked if I was going to leave. I told her I didn't know yet. She nodded like that was fair, which it was what she didn't ask. And what I didn't offer was what I was doing the hours I spent in the coffee shop on South Boulevard every morning before coming home. What I was doing was research, because Robert Cahill had told me something in that first meeting that I hadn't fully processed until later. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that in North Carolina, alienation of affection was still a viable civil cause of action. That meant that under certain circumstances, a third party whose conduct contributed to the breakdown of a marriage could be held legally liable. He hadn't recommended it as a path. He had simply mentioned it, the way good attorneys mention things, accurately and without emphasis, leaving the understanding for the other person to arrive at on their own schedule. I arrived at it on day 4. Tyler called on day 5. I let it ring the first time. The second time, I answered. His voice came through careful and low, the voice of a man who had been rehearsing this call for 7 months and still didn't know how to start it. James. Tyler. I could hear him breathing. Man, I waited. I don't have the right words for this. No, I said. You don't. He was quiet. I want you to know that He stopped. James. It wasn't supposed to. I interrupted him. Tyler. Yes. I'm going to ask you one question. He was very still on the other end. Did you know she was pregnant before I came home? A long silence. Yes. I absorbed that. You knew for 2 months. Yes. And you said nothing. James, I didn't call for an apology, I said. He went quiet. I called to tell you that I've spoken to an attorney. His breathing changed. He didn't speak. And I want you to know that whatever happens next, I kept my voice level. I will handle it correctly. The call ended shortly after that. I sat in the coffee shop booth for a while after. Outside the window, Charlotte moved through its ordinary morning. Commuters, delivery trucks, a woman walking a dog along the sidewalk. Ordinary life, which had the particular quality that morning of seeming very far away and very close at the same time. What happened over the next several months happened slowly, which is how things that actually matter usually happen. The divorce was filed in April. Robert handled it with the precision and care I had expected from him. Rachel and I had one long conversation in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, in which we said the things that needed to be said. Not everything. Not with the full honesty that only time eventually allows, but enough. She was not a villain, in my private accounting of the story. She had made choices that cost both of us something real. But she was also a person who had been left alone for 11 months with her own fears and her own weaknesses, and the particular vulnerability of a life that had been reorganized around an absence. I didn't forgive her in that kitchen on that Sunday. That came later and slowly and not all at once. But I didn't reduce her to the worst thing she had done either. Because the worst thing a person does is never the complete story of who they are. That's something the Army teaches you if you're paying attention. People are capable of more than their worst moment. They are also capable of more than their best one. The territory in between is where actual life happens. The child, a boy born in June, was Tyler's. The paternity question was settled legally as part of the divorce proceedings, which was a clean and correct way to handle it. Rachel moved to a smaller apartment in Charlotte. Tyler was transferred to Fort Lee in Virginia 4 months after the divorce was finalized, which was a coincidence of military logistics that neither of us had arranged, but that both of us acknowledged was probably for the best. I stayed in the house on Providence Road for another 6 months. Then I sold it. The civil case was filed in September. Alienation of affection Robert had walked me through it carefully over several meetings, not pushing, not advising me toward it, but making sure I understood what it was and what it wasn't. It isn't revenge, he had said at one of those meetings. It's accountability. Those are different things. I want you to be clear on which one you're pursuing. I had thought about that distinction for a long time. What I came back to every time was something simpler than revenge. What I came back to was a specific memory of Tyler's voice in those texts during deployment. Everything's good, man. Rachel's doing well. I had been 11 time zones away, carrying real responsibility in a forward operating environment, trusting the people I had left behind. That trust had been exploited in a deliberate and sustained way over many months. That wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a choice made repeatedly while I was deployed in service to the country we had both committed to. Accountability was the right word. The case proceeded quietly. Tyler retained an attorney in Virginia. The legal process moved at the pace legal processes move, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paper. I went back to work. I had taken terminal leave after returning from deployment and had been in the process of transitioning out of the Army before all of this happened. The transition continued. I accepted a position with a logistics consulting firm in Charlotte, whose clients included several Department of Defense contractors. The work was familiar and absorbing and provided particular grounding that useful work provides when everything else is in motion. I ran in the mornings. I called my parents on Sundays. I ate dinner alone most nights in the new apartment I had rented off Soane Avenue, which was smaller than the house, but mine in a way the house had eventually stopped being. I was rebuilding, which is not a dramatic process. It is a quiet and incremental one, the kind that doesn't announce itself and isn't visible from the outside until it's mostly finished. Robert called me on a Thursday in November with the settlement offer. Tyler's attorney had reached out. The number was significant, not extraordinary, but significant. It reflected the legal exposure and the duration of the conduct and the specific circumstances of a deployed service member whose trust had been violated by someone he had explicitly tasked with his family's care. Robert read me the figure over the phone and then was quiet for a moment while I absorbed it. "What do you think?" I asked. He said, "I think it reflects the reality of his situation accurately." He paused. "I also think you should take it, not because you wouldn't prevail at trial, but because trials cost more than money." I thought about that for a moment. The thing about Robert Cahill was that he gave advice the way good officers give orders, clearly with reasoning and with complete respect for your right to make the final call. I took the settlement. The paperwork was signed on a Friday afternoon in Robert's office. He shook my hand when it was done. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about that honestly. "Like something is finished," I said. He nodded. "That's the right answer." I drove home along Providence Road, passing the house where the old life had been. The lights were on inside. Someone else's life now, warm and lit from within, indifferent to what happened there before. I drove past without stopping. I want to tell you about the moment that mattered most in all of this, because it wasn't the settlement, and it wasn't the divorce, and it wasn't the phone call with Tyler or the conversation with Rachel in the kitchen on the Sunday afternoon. It was something smaller. It was a morning in October, about 6 months after I came home, when I was running along the greenway near my apartment in the early morning before work. It was cold and clear the way October mornings in North Carolina can be, with the light coming in low and the trees just beginning to turn. I was running at the pace I always ran, steady and without much thought, when I passed an older man sitting on one of the benches along the path. He was wearing a veteran's baseball cap, the kind with a unit insignia I recognized from Fort Bragg. He was sitting very still, looking at the creek, with a cup of coffee in both hands. I slowed down, nodded. He nodded back. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, sir." He looked at me for a moment. "You military?" I said. He nodded slowly. "You got that look," he said. "What look is that?" He smiled. "Like you're still figuring out what to do with your hands, now that you're not carrying anything." I laughed. "Something like that." He looked back at the creek. "It gets easier," he said, "the figuring out." "I know," I said. I was beginning to understand that he was right. Not because the things that had happened had stopped mattering. They hadn't, but because I had learned something over those months that I don't think I could have learned any other way. I had learned that the people who betray your trust tell you something important, not just about themselves, about the nature of trust itself, which is not a contract and cannot be enforced and does not come with guarantees. It is a choice you make every time, knowing the risk, and the fact that it can be broken doesn't mean it shouldn't be extended. It means the extending of it is the courageous act. I kept running. The morning stayed cold and clear. The trees kept turning. Life, in its particular way, continued. I met someone the following spring. Her name was Dana, and she worked in healthcare administration at a hospital in Charlotte. She was 35, thoughtful, with a particular quality of someone who had learned through experience to distinguish between what was urgent and what was important. We met at a dinner party hosted by a colleague of mine and talked for 2 hours in the kitchen about nothing particularly significant, and both went home thinking about the conversation. We had coffee the following week, then dinner, then the slow, careful process of two people who have both been through something real, deciding whether to trust the territory they're moving into. I told her about the deployment and Rachel and Tyler on our fourth date. Not because I was obligated, but because I had learned that the truth told early is almost always less expensive than the truth told late. She listened without performing sympathy, which was the right way to listen to it. Then she asked me one question. What did you learn? I thought about that for a moment. That carrying things quietly doesn't mean carrying them alone, I said. She nodded slowly. That's a good answer, she said. I thought so too. The civil case settlement was finalized in November. The divorce had been finalized in August. By the following spring, both were behind me in the way that completed things are behind you, present in memory, but no longer structuring the present tense. Tyler Marsh had been transferred twice since then, and was no longer part of any circle that intersected with mine. I didn't think about him often. When I did, I thought about what Robert Cahill had said. Accountability and revenge are different things. I had chosen accountability. That choice had cost me something and returned something in roughly equal measure, which in my experience is how most meaningful choices work. Rachel sent me a brief message the following Christmas. It said only, "I hope you're well." I replied, "I am." That was the end of it. The boy, whose name I never learned, was growing up somewhere in Charlotte in a life I had no part in and no need to be part of. That was the correct arrangement for everyone involved, including him. I thought about him occasionally, not with grief exactly, more with a quiet acknowledgement that there are lives that run adjacent to yours that you will never fully see, and that this is not a loss so much as the natural geometry of other people's existence. The last time I drove down Providence Road past the old house was in the fall of the second year after the deployment. Dana was in the passenger seat. We were driving back from a dinner in Myers Park, and the route took us past the neighborhood. The lights in the house were on again. The same warm light from within, some other family's ordinary evening. Dana looked at the house as we passed. That one, she said. I had mentioned it once. Briefly. Yes. She looked at it for a moment. It's a good house, she said. Yes. She turned back to the road ahead. The city moved past the windows. The heater ran. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening filled the car. I kept driving. And that, in the end, is what it looks like when something is finished. Not the settlement papers or the signed divorce documents or the phone call where Tyler had gone quiet when I asked him a question that ended our friendship. It looks like a warm light in a window you're driving past, a life continuing inside it, and you on the road, moving in a different direction, steady, clear, with someone beside you who chose you knowing the full weight of what you carried, and the particular freedom that comes from having finally set it down. If this story reminded you that trust is not weakness and silence is not surrender, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. And if you enjoy stories about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, come back, because the men who carry things quietly deserve to have their stories told too.